So my presentation is based around a couple of studies that we were involved in that was looking at some of these free support services. And as Ruth says, it's about kind of, can we improve the effectiveness of them for engaging with the at-risk groups, and can we test how well that improvement has worked? The context in question was a housing association based in London and the wider southeast of England, with over 40,000 homes, making it somewhere in the top 20 housing associations in the country. For those of you that don't know, housing associations are now the major provider of social rented housing in the UK, and social housing is very much a residualised tenure, by which I mean that the allocations mechanisms by which people get homes in social housing tend to result in people of more constrained means being allocated into those homes. So that means there's quite a lot of vulnerable people, quite a lot of people who could benefit from support. A lot of housing associations, particularly some of the larger ones, run free support services for their tenants. And this can include things like money and debt advice. In fact, that kind of menu that's up there are the sorts of things that the housing association I was working with had on offer to their tenants. And as I say, the service was free at the point of use to tenants. For the housing association, these are charitable organisations, non-profits, or at least profit-for-purpose organisations. They have dual motivations for wanting to provide these support services and for them to be effective. First of all, there's the social motivation, because they're there to help people. They don't want to boot them out onto the street. Eviction is very much seen as a last resort and not something that's going to be done for say, a small amount of rent arrears. But they do need things like their rent to be paid in order for them to remain viable. So they want to ensure that tenants have all of the resources available to them to be able to meet their obligations. And as I say, they have problems sometimes with engagement about ensuring that these services have the uptake that they might do. So to undertake this study, we adopted a standardised approach with the intention that by following a standard approach, we would really give the evidence users, give the housing association in particular, but also other housing associations, other similar providers, some confidence that this has really been undertaken as robustly as possible. And that hopefully at the end of the day, the evidence will be more likely to be used as a result. What that brings to the process is a degree of rigour, and the standard specifies certain things like pre-registration of a protocol, which really means just kind of putting out there in advance what you're going to do, and then following that as closely as possible, which kind of means that you're not moving the goalposts as you're running the study. So the standard of evidence, briefly, it's not a particularly complicated document, but to make sure everything's covered off well, runs to about sort of 60 pages. But kind of summarised on these next few slides, it fits into about 7 steps. First of all, you want to describe the problem that you've got and the context that you're operating within to help start thinking through the process. Then you design your intervention. You kind of look to the literature and look to examples of what other people are doing, or maybe look to what you're already doing and kind of document as accurately as possible what you're doing and think through whether there's other things you can draw upon. And the next, and it's potentially a brief step, but it's a crucial one, is to decide, are you going to proceed to a study? And if so, what type of study? Is this something that really needs a robust evaluation to test whether it's effective, or is it kind of just a variation on existing practice? You plan out that study, and as I say, you prepare a protocol, a document that says exactly what you're going to do in your study, and then you conduct the study and then publicise the findings. And then, the findings, putting them out there, are an important part of that to ensure they don't remain in somebody's file drawer, to make sure that these are used. The methodology that we used is a randomised control trial, and actually there were a pair of randomised control trial field experiments. Briefly, with a randomised control trial, what you do is you take your group of participants, in this case the tenants in the housing association, or the group of tenants who might be using the support service or trying to engage with the support service, and you split them at random into 2 or more groups. who get, in our case, a control group who got business as usual, whatever the old system was, and people getting the new system to find out how much the difference is. And for various reasons I won't go into this afternoon, those types of studies really provide some of the most robust evidence about whether whether your intervention, the change you've made, is responsible for any changes in outcomes that you observe at the end of the process. And in doing so, it produces what you might call evidence of what works. So rather than merely finding an association in the data, you're saying, did this change that we made in the world, the intervention, work in terms of the outcome that we were hoping to achieve? Did it improve, in this case, the rate of engagement with the support services? Another feature of the studies that we designed was that we made them as pragmatic as possible, and this is pragmatic in a technical sense defined in the literature, which means basically as close as possible to normal everyday practice. So when we ran these studies, obviously we had to put the mechanisms of randomization on the beginning and get somebody to say which arms are people going into, which intervention they're getting. Are they getting business as usual or the new thing? But other than that, we try to keep things as close to normal as possible without putting a load of extra resources in or without putting a load of extra training in, because that means that when you get to the end of it, the findings are as applicable as possible in everyday practice. Within this housing association, when we started the conversations and started having discussions with them about their processes and really understanding what was going on, we came to realise that there were basically two quite distinct situations. They had their process for tenants who were facing eviction, and this was kind of a particular trigger in their business processes that meant that they would be referred to support. And then there was everyone else. And those typically came from referrals. It could come from the income team, which is the rent collecting team, but it could also come from housing officers, from repairs officers. Anybody out and about engaging with tenants could say, hey, I think do you know we've got this support service, would you like me to refer? So all of the rest of the organisation could make referrals in. And because they followed slightly different processes, we were able to run two studies. They were run at the same time and within the same team, but with quite distinct participant populations or tenant pools within those studies. So the first study was looking at tenants who were facing eviction. As I said, this came from a business process, which was that at the point where the income team, the rent collecting team effectively, were saying, right, we need to advance this case to the point of taking court action. You know, we've done all of that, we've sent our letters, we've chased, we've sent notices and warnings and stuff. That triggered set a flag in their computer system, and each week the support service got a notice saying, right, here are the people who this week are, have been advanced to that state where they're going to be taken to court. And that would trigger an offer of support. Historically, and again, this came as part of that process of understanding the problem, we found that there was very, very low response rate from that letter. And it was a letter fired out to people who were, no doubt some of the most vulnerable. So a lowish rate is not to be unexpected, but it was very, very low, down somewhere below the 7%. And over the period of that study, running it for 3 months, we had about 250 participants that came through that we were able to randomise into that study. The intervention was just to say, as I say, it's kind of pragmatic, doing what's possible, was to take the old letter, and we reviewed it, and we compared it against a new letter. So actually, the organisation wasn't going to be able to invest a lot necessarily in doing things very, very differently, but, changing the text of a letter that goes out was quite simple and something we could easily test. The new letter that we drew upon a range of things from the behavioural science literature. Loss aversion, which is the sense that losses are often perceived more forcefully in the mind than benefits. So the letter mentioned, we tried to put it as positively as possible, but say, we could save you from losing your house. That kind of thing, to say, hey, here's the loss that you're facing, can we persuade you to engage? Because, hopefully we'll be able to support you. Social proof, although I said, less than 7% of people in this group were engaging with it, we were able to say in the letter, last year, over 4,000 tenants of this housing association made use of our support service. So you're able to sort of use the fact that lots of people do this. You kind of normalise it and things like that. The power of free, press home that it's not going to cost them anything, because free is actually sometimes found in the literature to have benefits beyond just the price of low cost. It kind of seems to somehow add extra benefits onto the perception of an intervention. And those benefits that we were talking about, we tried to make them as immediate as possible. So we might be able to get you more money this week. And the tangibility, because come to a support service is quite intangible. It might not, how do you judge whether that's something worth your while doing? We tangibilize it, and by talking about kind of on average, people who used our service last year gained an extra £600 or whatever the number was. But probably, and our study wasn't designed to unpick the effects of all of these different parts, but probably to my mind, the single most important part of this is we cut it down from a 3-page letter that kind of drifted all over the shop to something that was fitted comfortably well within 1 page, was very clear, that said, please call us or email us on this number, call us on this number, email us at this address, get in touch, we can help you. Very brief, very to the point, clear call to action. So here are the results. I should mention, we tested this across 2 stages of engagement. So the Housing Association had a process. You'd phone in and you'd speak to a gateway advisor who was basically working in a triage role. And the gateway advisor would say, right, I think you need money and debt advice, or I think you need employment and training support, and would refer you on to the appropriate form of specialist support. So the most important, from our perspective, the most important outcome is, do you actually end up engaging with that specialist support? Because that's where we think the value lies in the service. But it's helpful for us to monitor kind of earlier along that chain, whether anything happens. And what we found is this, there. So from sort of 5 to 6%, depending on which stage you're looking at, engaged with the old letter, up to kind of 15 to 18% engaged under the new letter. So something like a 10 to 12, 13 percentage point increase. Or if we want to kind of overblow it, tripled the rate of people engaging, which is reasonable, although it does kind of tend to overstate the importance of it. Importantly, rather than kind of trying to measure things with p-values and statistical significance, instead of doing that, we placed confidence intervals, uncertainty intervals, if you like, around our estimates. So saying, right, okay, the difference that we see here is about 10%. We place an we can calculate a confidence interval around there, and says actually kind of a plausible range of values could be anywhere between 3 and 17, 18%. But that's sufficient for us to say this looks like this intervention was superior. And here's kind of a graphical representation of that. Somewhere over here, actual null, that's kind of, if there was 0 effect, that's the sort of 10% line. And this kind of sort of try and symbolize the range, that confidence interval, the range of plausible effects that we think the data are compatible with. In our second study, the other tenant referrals, as I mentioned, it's from all of the other roles across the housing provider. Again, they had this process, though in this case, the gateway advisor, having received the referral, would make an outbound call. So the gateway advisor would try and call the tenant who's been referred to do that triage function, and then, if successful, they would refer on, and the specialist advisor would try and make a call based on that assessment of needs. Again, looking at the historic data, there was attrition at both stages, both from that point of referral to gateway. Not everybody who's referred in answered the phone to the gateway advisor, and not everybody that the gateway advisor referred on ever engaged with their specialist advice. This was a larger pool of tenants, so closing on 700 people in the study, again over a similar sort of 3-month period. Because the situation there had these 2 different stages, we actually tried 2 different interventions, each of them randomized separately. So first of all, we dropped in an SMS text message before the gateway advisor. We had an administrator either send out a text message or not. Business as usual was to not send out a text message saying the gateway advisor is going to be calling, and we added this in. And similarly to the other one, though the letters were different, but we also did a rework letter. So after the gateway advisor had had a conversation, the letter that went out following up between that and the specialist advice, we reworked. And again, drew on a similar body of behavioural literature to identify the features that we wanted to put into all of those communications. And I've gone and done my spoiler. I was going to do a show of hands. Sometimes I've done a show of hands, and when I've spoken to housing association audiences, and particularly if I've presented this study first, nearly everybody thinks the SMS is going to be the most effective. Because there's actually quite a big history in social landlords of using SMSs. They find that they help with all sorts of things like getting people to be present when their gas safety checks being done, or to make repairs appointments and things like that. In this case, we found that it didn't make much difference at all. Depending on which stage we're looking at, maybe kind of 3-4% decrease in the engagement, maybe 1% up, but with the confidence intervals spanning right over from positive into negative. And you can see that all the better on the diagram. No strong reason to really believe that this SMS was having much of an effect in either direction, or at least the data is compatible with such a wide range of things. You certainly wouldn't have any confidence that this is having a beneficial effect. Actually, importantly, one of the changes that although I said it's important to make your protocol up front and not move the goalposts, we did make a change, which is fully documented in all of the paperwork that goes around this, and we changed the analysis on this because the colleagues in the Housing Association said, actually, this SMS adds a bit of time into our process. So we said for this one, instead of saying, well, we'll keep it in if it's not appreciably worse, they actually said, well, for us to keep this SMS in the process, we actually strictly want to know that it's better than no SMS. So the analysis there is slightly different, but as you can see, it's no evidence of effectiveness. The letter that we put in this second study fared a bit better. The difference on the face of it is nearly 8 percentage points, though with the confidence interval, because we're only at this stage looking at the smaller group of people who had successfully been through Gateway, so we're only looking at about 250 people at this stage. The confidence interval again spans into positive and negative, so we ultimately declare it to be inconclusive. On balance of probabilities, it probably boosted engagement, but not to the extent that we'd say, we have a degree of confidence about this. Though interestingly, because it's just one letter against another, it doesn't really require extra effort. For a practitioner, that's probably the sort of evidence that you could say, actually, this span of plausible ranges gives us a reasonable degree of confidence to say we would be happy to make that change in our process. So briefly, with a few conclusions and future directions. The first thing to say is by kind of drawing on academic literature, in this case the behavioural science literature, looking at things like engagement processes, that it's certainly possible for practitioner organisations to work with academics and researchers and to produce practical, relevant improvements, but they are not guaranteed. And that's fine, actually. And what that actually speaks to is to say where they're plausible, feasible, ethical, effect, and reasonable to conduct, actually running studies like randomised control trials have a lot of benefits, both for finding out, can we do this new thing, and will it make a difference to the outcome that we really want to achieve, but also, can we find out if there are some things that we're doing or that we're considering doing that aren't effective? Because if, actually probably prior to this study, I think there would have been a good chance that if somebody had said to the Housing Association, you need to stick an SMS into your process there, they'd have just gone ahead and done it. And they'd have wasted, dozens and dozens of staff hours on doing that week in, week out. And okay, it's only pennies on sending out an SMS these days. It wouldn't have been a huge financial hit, but would definitely have had a time impact. So avoiding things that are ineffective are equally valuable. I'd make a call for using more of these analyses, particularly if you're talking to practitioners around finding a point estimate, so saying we've got a few percent points of estimates and the uncertainty around it, rather than looking at p-values, which are rather abstract from the outcomes of interest. And I'd say that actually kind of following the standardised process is helpful for ensuring that you tick all the boxes and know that you've brought rigour to the process that you're following. I was recently kind of asked by the Alliance for Useful Evidence to produce a paper which was published, and the references are all at the end. And I think there are more areas where different types of studies could have standards behind them. But potentially also another way that we can take this forward is to produce evaluation toolkits that support users who are perhaps not comfortable with evaluations, to actually support them to undertake certain parts of this. And that's certainly something that we're working on in the Catalyst project, which is one of the partners of BLG going forward. I guess these will be available as handouts, so there's acknowledgement slides and pages of references at the end. And I finished about 4 seconds late, I think.
I'm from the School of Social Work at UEA, and so I'm interested in the practical applications of this data analysis, and I've got my conclusion really in the title of our slide, that what I'm going to argue is about children who are taken away from their families and into the care system. We shouldn't be thinking about these children as separate from their families. When we look at what actually happens to these children, where do they go, where do they end up, that the vast majority of these children remain quite closely connected to their families. So we're going to look at that with some of the data. So we're going to talk about who are looked after children and our research questions, and tell you a bit about our data analysis. I'll come back at the end and talk about the implications for practice, and Lisanne is going to talk you through the analysis that we've done. So looked after children, this is a specific term from the Children Act 1989, and children are deemed to be looked after if they're accommodated by the local authority. So that means they're in a home, a foster home, a residential home provided by the local authority for more than 24 hours. If they're on a care order, this is a legal order that gives the local authority parenting responsibility for that child. Or another order, a placement order, which gives the local authority permission to place the child for adoption. So if any of these apply, a child is looked after. Most looked after children are accommodated, but not all of them. So some of them might be on a care order, but at home with their parents. But mostly they're living away from their parents during the time they're looked after. So there's about 75,000 children in England who are looked after, and this is the highest figure since the Children Act 1989, and the figures have been going up steadily, but particularly increasing in the last 5 to 10 years. And I think it's generally acknowledged that the family justice system is kind of in crisis. There's been a recent report called The Care Crisis that has tried to explore and unpick the reasons why so many more children are coming into care. So it's really important to look at who these children are and what's happening to them. We see not just this increase in children in care, but really very large variations between local authorities. So 20 children per 10,000 in Wokingham and 184 per 10,000 in Blackpool. Massive differences. So I think this is an argument for studying what's happening with children in care at a local level, because there are such drastic differences. Now, for children in care, a really central plank of policy for children is that we need to not have children in impermanent situations and moving from place to place. That it's really important for children's development to know that they're going to stay in one place with one family, that they have a sense of belonging, that they're loved. So this is the goal, really, for all children in care, to achieve this for them. Now, the law guides practitioners really, wherever possible, to try for this permanence to be, obviously, with their own parents, so that, they'll come into care and we'll get them home. But where that's not possible, there's a range of other options. And this is what we were exploring in our research, is how, where do children go? Where do they end up? And do they end up in permanent placements? So the questions we were looking at with data from one local authority across several years were, what were the characteristics of children coming into care in this local authority? And then we've done lots of analyses, but today we're going to focus on just really where were the children at the end of our study period? Where did they end up? And we looked at these different groups. The children who did go home, and within that there were a subset of those who came back into care. Children who left care on a special guardianship order. This is an order, mostly it's former foster carers and grandparents who are offering children a home, or residence order. Again, this tends to be relatives. So this is kinship care mostly. Children who were adopted, children who were leaving care at age of 16 or 17 to go into independent living, and children who stayed more than 2 years in care. And we were analysing what factors predicted which children went where. So I'll hand you over to Lisanne now.
Thank you. So the data we used for this research was the looked after children data, also known as LAC data. This is an annual census where local authorities will submit data, characteristics of the children that they look after during a financial year to the Department for Education. So we used data from one local authority in England, and we had data of 8 consecutive financial years. And from this, we selected children who entered social care between April 2009 and April 2015 and followed them up until April 2017. So the reason for this, how we selected the children, was because in this way we have information for their entire stay in care. So from the start until the end. And then the extra follow-up time, with that we can be more certain of where they end up, so what the destination is, but also if they leave care, whether they will come back into care. We excluded children who had planned short breaks or who came into care due to offending. The research methods used was a longitudinal data analysis. So the data that was provided came in year by year, and what we did is we linked the data across years so that we have an entire pathway or period of care for each child. And this is something new. So what the Department for Education does, they publish summary statistics for each year, and that is cross-sectional, and then they compare it to what was happening in previous years, and they do this in an aggregated way, so they could compare regionals and local authorities. But what we do is we do it on child level, so individual level from start to finish. And we examined what factors were associated with different placement pathways. We did this by computing Cox proportional hazards regression, and this type of regression is typically used for time to event data. So the time element is their time in care, and then the event are the competing pathways that Beth described in the previous slide. So this is an overview of what children were in care. We had about 2,200 children who started to be looked after in the study period. And as we said before, some children leave care and come back, and that resulted in about 2,500 periods in care. We had roughly the same amount of boys and girls. The biggest age group was the children who started between age 0 and 4. These were mainly children from a white ethnic background, that is 90%. We saw a clear trend in deprivation, where most children came from the most deprived quintile, and only 4% came from the most affluent quintile. About half came into care due to abuse or neglect. The next biggest group was family dysfunction with a prevalence of 20%. About 70% came into care on a voluntary agreement, so the remaining would be on a care order or the other orders that Beth described. And most children were placed in a foster home when they entered care. Here you can see a graph of where the children were at the end of the study period. So with our study period, we have a minimum follow-up of 2 years, and the exits are return home, special guardianship or residence order, adoption, independent living, other exit, or staying in care for the long term, that is 2+ years. And we stratified this by age at entry, and what you can see is that there are different exits, or that the exits depend on age at entry. So we see with the younger group of children that adoption and special guardianship is more likely, and then it shifts to, with the older ages, that independent living is a plausible exit. And then the middle group of children, it could be long-term in care. And overall, we see that return to home is quite prevalent, about like 38%, which is the greatest pathway, or the most prevalent one. So just to summarize the previous graph, we've competing destinations. At age 0 to 3, the competing destinations are return home or adoption. Then with the next age group from 4 to 11 at entry is return home or long-term in care. And then with the oldest age group from 12 to 17 at entry, the competing destinations are return home or independent living. So the time spent in care differs by exit or pathway destination. And so the shortest amount of time is an average spent if they go to return home. And so they spend on average in care for 1.5 months. This is followed up by a special guardianship or residence order. These children spend on average 6 months in care. Then the next one is independent living, just a bit over 1 year in care. And then adoption, it's 1 year and 8 months. And then so we define long-term in care as 2+ years, 2 or more years in care. And so at this time point, we can sort of be certain what destination the child would be at. Okay, just to repeat, so the most common destination is that children return home. And now the question is, which children are more likely to return home? So the ones who are more likely to return home are children aged 10 to 14 at entry of a non-white ethnic background, those who entered care on a voluntary agreement. Children who are less likely to return home are the ones who entered in later financial years. So this could reflect change in practice. We didn't find any significant difference by sex, main reason for entering care, and first placement type. So this means that boys and girls, for example, are as likely to return home. Now the question is, which children went home and came back into care? And we see that the prevalence is 25%. So the median time at home before returning to care was 4 months, and the median time of return stay in care was 11 months. And so that is on average 10 months longer than their initial period in care. So who are the ones who are more likely to return to care? Those are the children entering care at age 12 to 17 of a white ethnic background, who come from a materially deprived home, who entered care on a voluntary care agreement, and who had multiple placement changes in the previous period of care. Then the ones who are less likely to return to care are the ones who stayed longer in care before going home. And then we didn't see any significant difference by sex, main reason for entering care, first placement type, and financial year at entry. The next question is, which children left care on a special guardianship or residence order? So the prevalence was 9%, and this can be broken down by 6% on an SGO by former foster carers, 56% SGO by other carers, and 38% on a residence order. Their median time in care was 6 months. The children who are more likely to leave on an SGO or RO are those entering care due to abuse or neglect, and those entering in later financial years. Children who are less likely to leave on an SGO or RO are the ones who enter care at an older age, and their first placement in care is at a foster home. Again, there was no significant difference by sex, ethnicity, and legal status at entry. Then the question is which children were adopted. We see a prevalence of 14%, but a way higher prevalence in children at age 0 to 1, and that is 44%. And their median time in care was 1 year and 8 months. We see that girls were more likely to be adopted and those who entered in later financial years, and that reflects change in policy. Children who were less likely to be adopted was the children who entered at a later age. There was no significant difference by ethnicity, main reason for entering care, legal status at entry, and first placement type. Then, which children left care for independent living? That was overall 15%, however, that is more focused at older ages. So the prevalence is actually 61% in children who entered at age 16 and 17. Their median time in care was 1 year and 1 month. Children who are more likely to live independently, they were older age at entry, entered care due to abuse or neglect, entered care on a voluntary agreement, and entered care in the later financial years. Children who were less likely to live independently were children who had their first placement in a foster care. There was no significant difference by sex and ethnicity. This is the final research question, and so the results slides, and this is which children stayed long-term in care. So that is for 2 or more years. And the prevalence was 18%, but again, we see that it's more clustered in children in the middle age group, so the prevalence was 55% in children aged 7 to 10 at entry. The children who were more likely to stay in care for the long term were children aged 5 to 11 at entry, who entered care on a care order, who had their first placement in a foster home, and entered care in later financial years. Children who were less likely to stay in care were children who were aged 12 to 17 at entry. And we did not find any difference by sex, ethnicity, and main reason for entering care. Now I'll give the floor back to Beth.
Okay, so lots of information about these children here. I think what this research reveals, I think there is a value in this local authority level longitudinal analysis, and particularly this breakdown by age at entry. So there's lots of interesting things in there. You might have noticed that this data can't tell us why they're happening. Like, why is it that children from ethnic minority backgrounds are more likely to go home, and that those returns are more likely to be successful? This data can't tell us, but it gives that local authority something to think about. They've got lots of other data that might give them the answer to that question. When we've presented some of our data to the local authority, things that we've been curious about, but we don't know why it's happening, they're like, oh, well, we did that in this year, and maybe that's why these figures have gone up. So some of the questions that the data raises, local authorities have got the power to dig into and look at. I think thinking about what happens to children by age at entry is very useful. You know, we can see those children coming in middle childhood, 9, 10, and 11. They're the children most likely to be staying long term. We need to recruit long-term foster families for those children, because for about half of them, there isn't an alternative. They're not going to be adopted realistically. They're not going to go home to their grandparents. So, if you know how many children are coming in that age band, you can plan when you're recruiting foster carers how many short-term foster carers you need, but how many long-term foster carers. That's quite important, because long-term foster carers are maybe a different pool of people to short-term foster carers. They're maybe a little bit more like adoptive parents. They want to offer a child a permanent family base. We know children, going back to that original slide about a sense of permanence, we know from a lot of our other research at UEA that children can have a sense of permanence and feel they belong in a foster family. But that family has to be committed to long-term care, so we can predict how many of those people we need. You can also see in your local authority, if you've got a lot of children coming in under one, you need quite a large pool of prospective adopters for those children. I think although there's some useful information that can be gleaned by looking at this type of data and looking at the child level longitudinally, there's so much more that local authorities could learn if this data can be linked to the other data that they have. So there's another data set that people give to the government, which is the Children in Need data set. This is about services that are provided to families really before children come into care. There's some interesting variables in there. We tried to get this data and link it and work with it, but we didn't quite achieve it for all the reasons that James has set out. There's data on early help, even a layer of intervention before children in need. And then there's the detailed case records about these children, which might be what we need to answer questions like, why is it these ethnic minority children are having successful returns home? So there's more to be done, but I think all the effort that seems to go in the local authority is to collect it in order to give it to the government, and then analysts in the local authority feel maybe they have little resources left to do this type of analysis. In terms of implications for social work practice, I think we see very clearly we can't think of children about them being either at home with their families or in care. Most of these children say strongly connected to their birth families. So it's the biggest destination is children going home. We see that when children stay longer in care, they're more likely to successfully go home, because that gives the family more time to maybe address the problems as to why the child came into care. So what as social workers are doing in that period to help families is very important. Children leaving care for independent living, they often need a lot of help to reconnect with their families, or they've remained connected while they stay in care. We know that children in long-term foster care and adoption, most do have some contact with their families, and that benefits them if it goes well. So it isn't a question of you're the family social worker until the child comes into care, and then you're the child social worker. You've got to stay being the child and family social worker. Okay, thank you very much.
Talking about market concentration, supply, quality and prices paid by local authorities in the English care home market. And this is joint work with a number of colleagues at UEA and elsewhere. And I'd like to say to begin with that this is a relatively new area for me, and there are people in the audience and previous speakers, Stephen particularly, who's done a lot of work in this area. What am I going to be talking about? I'll say a little bit about the policy background, which in many ways is the motivation for what we're trying to do here, the research questions we're trying to answer, the data, and then from the data give you a little bit of an overview, a general overview of the English care home market, and then talk about how we are measuring the degree of concentration in the English care home market, and what we find when we look at that in the English care home market, in particular the differences that we find if we think about the market for nursing home care separately from the market for residential care, and also if we count for what we're going to be calling locally chained care homes. So by which I mean care homes which are owned by the same owner within a local authority, so a group of 2 or more care homes in the same local authority owned by the same organisation. And then what we've been looking at is what local factors appear to influence the level of concentration in a care home market, and what is the impact of high concentration on market outcomes such as the supply of care home places relative to potential demand, the quality of care home places, and the prices that local authorities pay, and then draw out a few conclusions. So the policy background really is the 2014 Care Act, which placed duties on local authorities to promote the efficient and effective operation of a market in services for meeting care and support needs, what are sometimes called market shaping responsibilities. And within that, amongst other things, to ensure the sustainability of the market and to foster continuous improvement in the quality of such services. So supply is important, quality is important. And a recent report by the Competition and Markets Authority, who did a study of the UK care home market, said that local authorities should have effective procurement strategies which should encourage competition amongst care homes based on delivering good outcomes for residents and value for money for local authorities and the taxpayer. So while there's nothing explicit in any of there that says anything about the prices that local authorities should be paying, implicitly, if they're seeking to have to get value for taxpayers' money, there's a presumption that they should be paying not over the odds at any rate for the care home places that they support. So a little bit more specifically on the research questions that we're trying to address. The first one is simply to try to describe what local characteristics which are largely outside the control of local authorities, make local authorities susceptible to a high degree of concentration in the local care home market. So to some extent, we're kind of asking the question, which local authorities might have more difficulty than others in discharging these new duties of market shaping? And then what are the implications of this susceptibility for the prices that they pay and for the quality of care homes in their local authorities and the supply of care home places relative to likely demand? So we're trying to describe how local characteristics appear to influence the degree of concentration, and then to see what association that has with some of these key market outcomes. The data that we're using, like Stephen earlier, we're using primarily data from the Care Quality Commission. We're just using data, a single point in time, January 2016, and we have data on 11,336 care homes who were active at that point. And again, like Stephen, we're focusing on care homes for older people, which we define as those who offer services for people aged 65 and over or people with dementia, given that dementia is predominantly a condition suffered by older people. So many of these care homes can offer other services, but to be in our study, they have to offer services for older people or with dementia. We've also used data from NHS Digital on local authorities' average payment to care home for people aged 65 and over in the financial year 2015 and 16. So this is our measure of the prices that local authorities are paying. So we have that the average level that a local authority was paying in that year. We've also been able to link in some data, industry data from Lang and Lisanne, who undertake each year a market survey of care homes, and through the data centre here we've negotiated access to that. And we use that to complement the data from CQC, because we were interested in this question of whether the conclusions you reach about the degree of concentration in the care home market is different if you take account of care homes who are owned by the same person, same organisation within a local authority. And that data isn't compulsory for care homes to provide to CQC, but Lang and Lisanne have collected that for many years. So we were able to use that, and also to use their information on whether or not a care home was a for-profit organisation or a not-for-profit organisation. We use data on 148 out of the 152 local authorities who have social services responsibilities in England. There were 4 local authorities which are either rather peculiar in nature or for whom there were some data problems. So in the data set, as I said, we had 11,336 care homes, of whom 6,351, so a little bit more than half, were what we called locally chained in 856 local chains. Now, many of these chains are quite small chains. They may have only 2 or 3 care homes. You're probably familiar with sort of Bupa, which has about 100 care homes across the country. But many of these groups are much smaller than that. 63% of all the care homes are residential and 37% are nursing. What I mean by nursing, and this is a CQC registration category, is they offer nursing care. They may also offer residential care, but they offer the services of a registered nurse within the home, whereas the residential home is not able to cater for people who have need for a registered nurse. The table here shows you the average number of places in these care homes. So what you see from this is that nursing homes are generally bigger than residential homes, and chained homes tend to be bigger than non-chained homes. So on average, overall, there are 36 places per care home, but for nurses it's 51, and if they're in a locally chained group, that's 55. For residential homes, the average is 27, and if they're locally chained, it's 32. This chart here provides a little bit more background information. So the chart on your left and my left, yes, distinguishes between whether care homes are residential and nursing and whether or not they are chained. The yellow and slightly deeper, sort of browny yellow colour are residential homes. The 2 blue colours are nursing homes. In that left-hand pie chart, the bright yellow, can I get this thing to work? So here, 32% of residential homes are locally chained, of all care homes, 32% are residential and not locally chained, and 30% are residential and locally chained. So within residential care homes, it's fairly evenly split between whether they're chained or not. That's in contrast to nursing homes, who overall make up about 38% of care homes, and they are much more likely to be locally chained. So it's much more likely that a nursing home is one of a chain than it is for residential homes. On the right-hand side, we have division by whether the care homes are for-profit or not-for-profit. And what you see there is that there are a very small number, just 4% of the overall market for care homes are nursing homes which are not for profit, whereas you actually have quite a substantial proportion, 15% overall, of residential homes that are not for profit. But that said, the vast majority of care homes in England are running on a for-profit basis. CQC conduct inspections of care homes and give them quality ratings on a 4-point scale. They have an overall rate which is based on some subcategories, and they rate them from inadequate to outstanding. About 2/3 overall of care homes are rated good or outstanding. In fact, very, very few are rated outstanding. I think it's not much more than 1% overall. But there is a difference depending on whether you're talking about residential homes or nursing homes. So residential homes are much more likely to be rated good or outstanding than nursing homes. So 70% for residential homes and 62% of nursing homes. The proportion who are rated good or outstanding is slightly higher among chained homes, but this is mainly because quality is higher amongst chained than non-chained residential homes. There's not very much difference within nursing homes. So being part of a chain does seem to improve quality if you're a residential home, but there seems to be less effect for nursing homes. Okay, so we want to have some kind of measure of the degree of concentration in a local authority market, and we use a commonly used measure in competition economics called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, or HHI. It's based on market shares, and we implement it as on the basis of the share of care home places that each supplying entity has in a local authority. If the HH index is 1, that means there is a single supplier or a monopoly. As the HH index approaches 0, that means there are many suppliers, each with equal and very small market shares. The Competition and Markets Authority says that an HH index greater than or equal to 0.1 means that the market is concentrated, and if it's greater than or equal to 0.2, then it's highly concentrated. We use, as a definition of the market, the local authority boundary, and as Stephen showed earlier, there's a debate to be had about what is the appropriate boundary. But given that we are motivated in large part by the responsibility that a local authority has to shape its market, it seems reasonable for this purpose, at any rate, to focus on the local authority boundary. We look at all care homes in the local authority together, and we look at nursing homes and residential homes separately. And we look at what difference it makes if you assume that every care home within the local authority is in competition with every other one, or if you think that groups owned by the same owner are not in competition with each other, so that the entity, if you like, is the chain or the single care home where it just has it's one other. There's no other care home owned by the same person. And what we find, on average, the care home market is not concentrated, and I think that is consistent with all other analysis and research in this area. You know, the English care home market is characterised by lots of small care homes, many of which, as we've seen already, are just owned by a single organisation. However, there's considerable variation across local authorities, and it makes a difference if you separate the nursing and residential care markets. If you do that, then 25% of local nursing home markets exceed the CMA threshold for concentrated, exceed a threshold of 0.1. Treating each local chain as a single entity and separating nursing and residential care markets, we actually find that on average concentration exceeds the threshold for both markets. And for more than 25% of markets, concentration is well above the threshold. It doesn't reach the threshold for highly concentrated, but it's well above the threshold for concentrated. What are the factors that seem to be associated with market concentration? Well, we looked at a number of things, some of them similar to local characteristics that we looked at earlier in this subject. So the percent of the 65 and over population receiving pension credit, which is a means-tested benefit, which implies they're on relatively low incomes. And that seemed to have a positive effect on concentration. So in other words, in areas where there is more older people receiving pension credit, which probably also means more older people eligible for state support with help with their care costs, the market may well be more concentrated. Local house prices, interestingly, had a different effect on nursing homes from residential homes. So it appeared to be positively associated with concentration in the nursing home market, but negatively with a residential care home market. And we've speculated a bit on what that might be, but I'll leave that for a discussion point. It seemed to be negatively related by potential demand, and we defined, or we used as an indicator of potential demand, the number of women over age 75 living alone. Clearly they're not the only people who go into care homes, but it gives you an indication. So in other words, I mean, that sort of makes sense, where potential care home managers think there may be some demand, they will enter the market. It was also negatively related, so less concentrated in local authorities where a high proportion of the population are living in urban areas, so more concentrated in rural areas. And again, I think one can understand why that might be. We found that a local authority in London or the South East had no significant effect on the degree of concentration in the nursing home market, but appeared to be a positive effect in the residential care market. So the residential home market in London and in the South East tends to be more concentrated than in other areas. And again, I think that isn't altogether surprising. The more interesting question is, what does a degree of concentration mean for some of the market outcomes that are likely to be of interest to local authorities? What we did here is we used a regression, which is really what the previous slide presented the results of the level of concentration on a number of local characteristics to identify local authorities who have a high chance, a high probability of facing either an unusually high degree of concentration or an unusually low degree of concentration in the nursing home and in the residential care home markets. And then we devised an impact measure, which was the percentage difference in the average values of quality, supply, and price in local authorities facing a high probability of being a high concentration local authority and local authorities facing a high probability of being a low concentration. Sorry, lots of highs and lows there. But basically, if your propensity to be concentrated is high, what's your average level of supply, price, and quality? If the chances are you're in a low concentration area based on the characteristics of the area, we average the quality, supply, and price, and then we take the difference. Initially, we used a threshold of 60% for probabilities, and we took the bottom and top quartile of the predicted distribution of concentration. And throughout all this, we've also taken into account the chained care homes. I've got 30 seconds left. And what we found was that the impact on the price that local authority pays of concentration is positive in all markets and in the overall market. The impact on quality is also positive, and I think that's consistent with previous literature, but it was only statistically significant in the residential care home market. So there are some potential benefits from concentration as well as some potential costs. The impact on supply was negative, but again, it was only significant in residential care homes. So a residential care home with a high probability of high concentration probably would have something like 57% less supply relative to demand than a low concentration one. My last slide. Conclusions and caveats. So, as I've said, on average, the care home market seems to be not concentrated, but it can make a difference whether you treat nursing homes and residential homes in separate markets and whether you take account of chains. I won't go through again what I just put on the previous slide, but concentration has some effect on prices, quality, and supply. The results we found are robust to quite a range of how we define high and low tendency towards high and low concentration. The scale of the effects can be quite sensitive to how you treat certain local authorities and whether you include local authority-run care homes and their prices. But the overall conclusion is there's probably likely to be considerable variation across local authorities in the challenges that they face in discharging their market-shaping duties. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm very interested in how, when you're doing longitudinal research in particular, you take account of the complexity and the volatility of the policy environment. A number of those longitudinal charts that we saw both in adults and children's social care, as someone in a local authority, I can say, oh, well, that was Winterbourne View, that's why that changed that. And over here, that's because we've got staying put, for example, with different kinds of policy. And I'm wondering how, or if we can include those kind of changes in our model, or if there are ways post hoc that we can then test that with the sector to try and understand what it is that we're finding. Because I think there's some kind of context around some of these findings that's really important.
Okay. Then would you, that obviously partly came from Beth and Lisanne's presentation, but I think some of it was actually relevant to from Jose Luis' presentation as well, and perhaps Steve. So
yeah, I can start. Let me think here. So yeah, you could do like a contrast analysis of like before implementation of a new policy and after, or if it's like more gradual change, or like something that's called like a discontinuity regression. And that was, I'm sorry, I think...
That's exactly what I wanted to know.
Oh, okay. Oh, perfect then. Yeah.
Yeah, from an analysis point of view, there are tools that we can use to try and unpick some of those effects. And
yes.
I think that's really what I was getting at, because you know, when you talk about last financial years,
yes.
You know, that it changes over financial years, and it feels like there's national policy that's affecting that and local policy. And it's
exactly.
how do we kind of unpick that from a data perspective?
Mm-hmm.
That's what was
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, very relevant to the stuff that we're looking at. If you look at people with learning disabilities, I think the earliest case we've got is from 1974. So if you look at trying to understand, you know, something about what's happened to that person over that period of time, lots of different policies will have changed, lots of different. Another relevant example, we're doing a study looking at the impact of the CARE Act. Now the CARE Act is 2014, 2015. So, you know, it's more, but even trying to understand, trying to link, even with all the you know, the methods that you might apply to look for discontinuities in time, there's so many different things that are happening to the system. I'm sure that a lot of what we observe in terms of the changes between before and after 2015 are linked to money, you know, and the lack of money rather than the CARE Act. So, you know, even one has to, I guess what I'm trying to say is that you have to be very careful that sometimes even if you apply what looks like a very sound technique, you're not going to be able to control for all these other things that are happening at the aggregate level. So.
Can I just comment on that one? With the children's data, what we're moving on to now is we have got the national data sets using this data to look at things like long-term. We're doing a project on long-term foster care, another one on adoption. Now, the care crisis review that I mentioned said really there have been policy changes and national events that have contributed to the care crisis, but they're not the only reasons. But maybe with this national data set, we can explore that a little bit more using some of those methods that Lisanne has, because we'll have those local authority variations, but not everybody's responded in the same way to things that have happened at a national level. So we can maybe try some of those techniques.
Yeah, exactly. There was a question up there.
Okay, my question is also for Beth and Lisanne, I guess. So you mentioned that the longer children stay in care, the more successful their return home is. So I was just wondering then if that meant that perhaps you felt that time away from home, rather than earlier interventions within the family, would have better implications for long-term stability in the family home?
Could you repeat that last bit, please?
Yeah, so basically whether or not you